share.
How to make Rod more nervous.
There we go. Can you everybody see that okay?
Yeah, that's good.
Great. Okay, Rod, you're up.
Are you going to mute the rest of the people?
We'll mute ourselves.
Yeah, how about you do that? That would be great.
Well, then we can't heckle.
Okay. Now, are you able to press the play button, Heather?
So I'm able to move it forward. I will mute everybody except you and me. How's that?
Okay.
Okay, perfect. So you're on.
Okay. So are we going to page through this way, or are you going to go to the play button?
You're gonna tell me when to move forward.
Okay. But if you do the play button, then you don't have the slides down the side.
Yeah, it's not letting me.
Not letting you do that? Okay, so whoops.
Yeah, see, it does that.
Okay.
Let's try this.
Oh, you're getting all the
Okay.
slideshow. Okay.
Perfect. There we go.
Well, good day, fellow members. I was originally going to speak only about the wine industry in the county and my winery, Black Prince, and combine it with a tasting of Black Prince Chardonnay and Cabernet Franc. Today, I've got that wine in my cellar, and I'm currently drinking a little Pinot Gris. But since we're meeting virtually, and we can't do a tasting, I decided to focus on the original settlement of Prince Edward County and the surrounding area some 235 years ago by what became known as the United Empire Loyalists, UELs, as they came north from the American War of Independence. Change slides, Heather. This shows a modern day map of the kind of route they would have taken from the Mohawk Valley up towards Kingston and going westwards towards the county. Among them was my great-great-great-great-grandfather, Johann Herkmer. So apart from being a history lesson, it is also my family's story, almost a classification speech as well. We start 422 years ago, when the Edict of Nantes was passed in France in 1598. This provided religious freedom for Protestants to practice their religion without persecution after many years and decades of religious wars. No slide yet, Heather. The edict was revoked in 1685 by Louis XIV, and over the next 25 years, some 400,000 Huguenots fled from Europe, many via England. Louis XIV even regretted his action with the loss of so many skilled tradesmen. The War of Spanish Succession started in 1701 and went on for over 10 years. Charles II of Spain was on his deathbed and had no heirs, and the remains of the Spanish Empire was a prize worth having. So the French Bourbons and the Austrian Habsburgs fought for this prize. The Duke of Marlborough made his name at the Battle of Blenheim in April 1704, when the Grand Alliance consisting of Austria, the Holy Roman Empire, and England defeated the French and the Bavarian army. War ravaged the countryside, and in particular east of the Belgium, Luxembourg, and French border in what was known as the German Palatinate. In 1709, some 13,000 German Palatinate Protestants fled down the Rhine River to Amsterdam and made their way to England, where the Crown had promised shelter and relocation. The sheer numbers overwhelmed the social services such as they existed in those days, and several thousand of the poor Palatines, who were unskilled rural laborers, were shipped to the north of Ireland to augment the Protestant population there. The next year, in 1710, some 3,000 were shipped to the New World and the British colonies. They had to work off the cost of their passage, and a large contingent were forced to settle along the Hudson River, below Albany in the right-hand corner of your map. Amongst them was my ancestor Johann Jost Urgemeyer, whose spelling was quickly anglicized to Herkimer. Their task was to collect pine for the timber for the British Navy. The Palatines didn't like their lot in life and protested to Governor Burnet that they were farmers and would like to return to those roots. Burnet negotiated a deal with an Iroquois nation, and 94 families were granted 100 acres each along the Mohawk River west of Little Falls. Little Falls is just above the red dot of Herkimer. Change slides. The Mohawk was a vital transportation route to the British to reach Lake Ontario and the west, as the French controlled the Lawrence River and the north side of Lake Ontario. The Herkimer's land controlled the portage at Little Falls and became quite wealthy as a result, charging a toll for every bateau that had to be taken up around the falls. The next 30 years were comparatively peaceful, but then the British and the French were at each other yet again in Europe in what was known as the 7 Years' War, and it spilt over into the New World in 1754 with supremacy between New France and the 13 British colonies in what became known as the French-Indian Wars. Many battles took place along the Champlain, Hudson, and Mohawk valleys, beginning with the French under Montcalm seizing Fort Oswego on Lake Ontario in August 1756, and the following year, following up with a victory at Fort William Henry. Slide, please. The British had put up a valiant defense, but the commander at Fort Edward refused to send reinforcements, and the British under General Moore surrendered to Montcalm. Here's the discussion on the surrender. Montcalm gave the British the honors of war, allowing them to retreat to Fort Edward and keeping their muskets, but no ammunition, providing they agreed not to fight for 18 months. What a very gentlemanly way they had in those days. The Huron Indian allies of the French were so incensed at not getting their usual trophies and prisoners that they set upon the retreating British and slaughtered and scalped many hundreds of them. This really upset Montcalm and infuriated the British General Amherst, which led to his vindictiveness later in the war when the shoe was on the other foot. Another British disaster was at Fort Carillon, new slide please, where the French under Montcalm had a significant victory. It's now known as Ticonderoga in July 1758. The British were under General Abercrombie, probably the most incompetent leader in the British Army. The British finally managed a very small victory in August 1758, new slide, when they went across Lake Ontario and seized Fort Frontenac. There, the British troops are burning down Fort Frontenac, which is where Kingston is today. With this victory, the British were able to enter the St. Lawrence River and plan to take, go back. Meanwhile, down east, the British were determined to retake Louisbourg, the greatest fortress in North America, new slide. And in June 1758, they were successful largely due to the leadership of a young officer, Brigadier General James Wolfe, under General Amherst. New slide. Here we see Wolfe assaulting Louisbourg. He took the troops around the side, which they hadn't expected, and they managed to burn the ships of the French fleet that was in the harbor. With this victory, the British were able to enter the St. Lawrence River and planned to take Quebec. In 1759, they lay siege to the city and planned the final assault. New slide. Here we have a depiction of Wolfe's troops, A, heading up to the cliffs, and B, on the Plains of Abraham. The French believed the attack would either come from further east along the North Shore or from a camp further upriver. They didn't believe an army could scale the cliffs. New slide. There is a story that there was only one soldier, Jean-Paul from Trois Pistoles, on guard on the plains, and he ran to his sergeant crying out, "Sergeant, sergeant, it is a bacon tree, it is a bacon tree." The sergeant replied, "Don't be stupid, Jean-Paul, it is a ambush, a ambush." Regardless, the warning was ignored, and we all know the result. Both Montcalm and Wolfe died at the battle. New slide. There's Wolfe on his deathbed on the Plains of Abraham, surrounded by not only his own troops, but the Indian allies. And now we move slowly towards the American Revolution. The British tried to recoup the costs of the French-Indian War and maintaining thousands of troops in North America by taxing the colonies, firstly through the Stamp Act of 1765, followed by the Townshend Acts of 1767, and finally the Tea Act of 1773, which led to the famous Boston Tea Party in December 1773 and the cry of "No taxation without representation." Hostilities began in April 1775 at Lexington and Concord, with Paul Revere's famous ride and the, quote, "the shot that was heard around the world." The early battles in 75, 76 were around Boston, New York, Trenton, and Princeton. But in 1777, it spread to the Champlain Valley, with the British taking Fort Ticonderoga in July and then suffering a humiliating defeat at Saratoga in September. The plan had been for General Burgoyne's army to come south from Canada across Lake Champlain, and General St. Leger's army to go up the St. Lawrence River and across the lake to Oswego River and the portage of the Oneida Carry, and then come down the Mohawk Valley to meet Burgoyne at Albany. The route was guarded by Fort Stanwix. New slide, please. Top left-hand corner is the town of Rome today, and Fort Stanwix was there. This was a Continental Army post. My great-great-great-grandfather, Johann Herkimer, was captain of a bateau bringing the British troops across Lake Ontario to Oswego. Meanwhile, his brother Nicholas Herkimer was brigadier of the American militia, and having been warned of a British attack along the Mohawk River, he raised a force of 800 men, and on August the 4th, 1777, set forth to relieve the siege of Fort Stanwix, camping at Oriska overnight on August the 5th. General St. Leger learnt by a message from Molly Brant to her brother Joseph Brant, the Mohawk leader, that Herkimer and his relief force were on their way, and he sent the Royal Yorkers to monitor Herkimer's position. And the next morning, Joseph Brant followed with 400 Indians and the Butler's Rangers. Nicholas Herkimer held a war council on the morning of August the 6th. He was expecting a message back from Fort Stanwix and wanted to wait, but his captains pressed him to continue, accusing him of being a Tory because his brother Johann was serving with the British under St. Leger. Nicholas was stung by this accusation and ordered the column to march on towards Fort Stanwix. There was a ravine at Oriskany where the Seneca Indians and the King's Royal Yorkers set up an ambush. The plan was for the Yorkers to stop the head of the column, after which the Indians would attack the extended rear of the column. At about 10 a.m., Herkimer entered the ravine and crossed the river and began ascending the other side. New slide, please. Contrary to plan, the Indians couldn't contain themselves and opened fire on the rear of the column too early, taking it completely by surprise. Herkimer turned his horse to see the action and was struck by a ball that shattered his leg and killed his horse. You can see his horse rising in the middle of that print. "I will face the enemy," he said as he was carried to a beech tree, and leaning against the tree, smoking a pipe and giving directions to his men. The battle continued, but many of Herkimer's men panicked and fled, pursued by Indians, resulting in a string of dead and wounded. A thunderstorm caused a break in the fighting, and Herkimer managed to regroup to higher ground. Meanwhile, word had reached Fort Stanwix, and a force of 250 men came out and raided the nearly empty camps of the British and Indians. One of the Indians guarding the camps ran to the battlefield to alert fellow warriors that their camps were being raided, and they disengaged with cries of "Una, Una," the Seneca signal to retire, causing the smaller number of loyalists to also withdraw. Herkimer was seriously wounded and had lost over half his force. He was carried from the battlefield and his leg was amputated. The operation went poorly and he died 10 days later on August the 16th. Last October, I visited the museum at Fort William Henry at Lake George and spoke to the Seneca historical guide. Mentioning my connection to Herkimer, he said, "Ah, yes, he had a competent surgeon, but not a great one. He made the cut at the wrong angle." How he knew this information, I really don't know. New slide, please. Herkimer's house is now a state museum. Oops. I must have missed a page here somewhere. This was one of the bloodiest battles of the war, and it had a long-term repercussions. While both sides claimed some sort of victory, there was no real winner. Herkimer lost over half his men, in some cases 3 generations from a family, and the Indians lost many of their chiefs, and it started civil war amongst the tribes of the Iroquois Confederacy, with Mohawks, Senecas, Cayugas, and Onondagas siding with the British against the Oneidas and the Tuscaroras, who supported the Patriots. The Loyalists and the Iroquois continued to hassle the Patriots in both the Susquehanna and Mohawk valleys, until in June 1779, George Washington gave instructions to General Sullivan to, quote, "lay waste to the Iroquois Confederacy and destroy their villages, their crops, and their food supplies, and take as many prisoners of every age and sex as possible. It will be essential to ruin their crops now in the ground and prevent their planting more." Did you know that George Washington was such a nice guy? The result of this campaign was that over 5,000 Iroquois fled to Canada, and the Crown granted 675,000 acres of land, including the reserves at Grand River, Tyndonega, and Akwesasne. Many Loyalists either went around the lake at Niagara or settled in Kingston area. They were promised land grants, and when the survey was completed west of Kingston in 1784, a small fleet of bateaux went up the lake to Adolphustown. New slide, please. And drew lots for their land. Adolphustown is just slightly up to the right of the red spot. Every Loyalist was entitled to 100 acres, plus another 100 if he had fought for the Crown, and additional acreage for being an officer, plus compensation for property left behind. Johann Herkimer, now a change in spelling to a Canadian version of Herchmer, didn't go west, but settled in Kingston with his land grant of 1,200 acres. New slide. There is a memorial plaque at Adolphustown and a Loyalist museum in the park. New slide. I went into the museum in 2009, which was the 225th anniversary of the landing, where they did one of these mock reincarnations of it. And I asked the young man at the desk, it's manned by Queen's University students, if he had anything on the Herkimers. He said, "Oh yes, Herkimer's Nose. It is the nickname for his now Lemoyne Point in Kingston. Tube 48 upstairs." Well, Tube 48 came down, and it contained a handwritten family tree of the Ergemeyer Herkimers going back to 1690 in the German Palatinate. Unfortunately, there were very few dates recorded of births, deaths, marriages, etc. Back in Kingston, Johann's son Lawrence was a successful merchant, and in 1817 built the Prince George Hotel, new slide, which is now beside the fantastic, splendid City Hall on the right. One of his sons, William Macaulay Herkimer, became rector at St. George's Cathedral, new slide. One of his sons, George Field Herkimer, went to Montreal, where he met and married Winifred Riddell, His father was one of the first chartered accountants in Montreal. If you're old enough, you may remember the firm of Riddle, Steed, Graham, and Hutchison. They had a daughter, Hilda, my grandmother, but George was a bit of a shit and ne'er-do-well and buggered off west to Winnipeg, where his brother Lawrence was a superintendent of the Northwest Mounted Police and gave him a job. I can find no record of his death, but the divorce papers back in Montreal in 1778 state that he's, quote, he was found living with a squaw near Fort Saskatchewan. Hilda was a talented young lady and studied to be a concert pianist in Leipzig. On returning to Montreal, she met and married Percival Galt, my grandfather, who was one of the 11 surviving children of Matthew Hamilton Galt, the founder of the Sun Life. New slide. Matthew's house, Brayhead, new slide, still stands at the top of McTavish Street and Pine Avenue, although it is now part of McGill University. His brother A.F. Galt, new slide, had an even bigger house, Rokeby, on Sherbrooke Street, but it was torn down in 1924 to make way for the Shadow Apartments. Percy and Hilda had 5 children. 2 of the boys went to school in the States and took up careers there. My mother married an Englishman. Her brother Randall had no children, and her sister Frances never married, and after her father died, she became secretary to Dr. Spears at Selwyn House School and a surrogate mother to many of the small boys. She was one of the earliest residents of Manoir Westmount. So I'm the only direct descendant left in Montreal, though my oldest brother is applying for Canadian citizenship at the age of 86. And of course, I have 2 sons and 3 grandchildren now in Montreal. Enough of this boring family history. New slide. Let's get back to Prince Edward County and Black Prince Winery. Just to emphasize their loyalty, the county is named after King George III's son, Edward, and the wards are all named after his children: Fredericksburg, Ameliasburg, Sophiasburg, Marysburg, Adolphustown. We chose the name Black Prince for the winery because we didn't particularly like King George's son, Edward, and the Black Prince was Prince Edward never came to the throne as he died before his father, Edward III, in 1673. Picton itself is named after General Thomas Picton, who was the Duke of Wellington's right-hand man at Waterloo and died there. And of course, the town of Wellington, 15 kilometers west of Picton, new slide, Black Prince Winery is located on Loyalist Parkway, just on the western side of Picton. We bought the 50-acre property from Dr. Hall in 2001. Next slide. This is an aerial view of the property with the 100-plus-year-old barn in the background and a Quonset hut behind that, where Dr. Hall's daughters rode their horses in winter, and it is now the winemaking facility. We were the 4th winery to get a license in the county, and there are now some 44 wineries. So how many will survive this lockdown is another matter, with no visitors coming to the county. The winery is open as, quote, an essential business, but we're not allowed to conduct any tastings. Buy online. New slide. This is the original house of Dr. Hall, where our tasting room and offices are located. New slide. This is the lobby. That's a suit of armor with me inside it as the Black Prince. New slide. Here is part of our tasting room. New slide. And here is the bar where the tastings take place. New slide. We have a nice little deck off the tasting room. We're on a nice summer day. You can sip. And in the background, you see the original barn. New slide. And there is our pizza oven, which makes the best pizza in the county because we are using toppings from our fruit vinegars that we are maturing in the barn there. New slide. This is the cellar room in the barn. This area is being used for the vinegars because we do have to maintain distance between vinegars and wine. wine does become vinegar if you're not careful. New slide. We have a reception area upstairs, which we can use for small parties. New slide. And there's a round table that I donated to the winery when I left Picton. And above it, new slide, is a wonderful old chandelier that is from Napoleonic times. Pete Bradford found this somewhere in the county and paid $15 for it, although a historian from British Columbia has said it's probably worth a couple of $100,000. I can't vouch for that, but very interesting. New slide. These barrels from González Spires in Spain are over 120 years old, and we managed to import them a couple of years ago. And this is where the start of the vinegar maturation process takes place. They haven't yet been infused with the fruits. New slide, please. Pete Bradford is the only cooper maker in the province of Ontario, and although his health has precluded him from making new barrels anymore, he does still refurbish them. New slide. Here is probably the last new barrel that he made. You know, a barrel costs between $1,000 and $1,200 and holds 325 liters of wine. So you can imagine the cost of maturing wine in new barrels every year. Only the first gross in Bordeaux can afford to buy brand new barrels every year. New slide, please. On the left is Jeffrey Webb, our general manager and winemaker, and on the right, Pete Bradford. In front of you, they are toasting a barrel. Now, a barrel is toasted to provide either a light toast, a medium toast, or a heavy toast, depending on what the winemaker is looking for in maturing his wine. A white wine would typically be in a very light toast barrel, and if you had a big red Cabernet, you might go for a heavy toast. Next slide, please. After about 40 minutes of the fire, there is an explosion where the barrel self-ignites, and these flames can go 10 to 15 feet in the air. At the bottom, you'll see a wonderful old little iron furnace that came from Kentucky. I think it was made in 1790. Next slide, please. Here is a nice ripe Cabernet Franc grape, about ready to pick. Next slide. Here we are in the fall, getting the vineyard ready for winter, cutting back some of the vines and fumigating. Next slide. And here we are in the middle of winter. Typically, we have to take one strand off the wire and bury it to protect it from the severe cold. Vines can typically accept maybe -15, but when it gets to -25, -30, it's likely to kill the whole plant. In addition, you mound the bottom of the roots, which is a labor-intensive process in the spring, unmounding. Next slide. This is our award-winning wines over the years. We've had Chardonnay, Cabernet Franc, Pinot Gris, Riesling, Merlot, etc. Next slide, please. Here are our award-winning fruit-flavored vinegars. We do about 5 fruit-flavored vinegars, raspberry, blackberry, peach, and a balsamic. I've been trying to make a connection with the salad bar people here, what we call Mandy's. So I think it'd be wonderful if they used them in their salads. The foodies just love it, but you need to give them a taste. And when we aren't able to give them tastes, it's hard to sell. Next slide, please. Another view of our tasting room. Oh, there's my daughter coming on saying the raspberry balsamic is awesome. She's a wonderful cook. Next slide. So a little recap of what we've done. We bought the land in 2001, 50-acre property on the Picton town line. We are unusual in having frontage on two streets, both Loyalist Parkway and Talbot Street. In 2002, we did extensive renovations to the barn and the house and planted a 10-acre vineyard. And in 2003, we opened to the public. We had a joust in the county tournament. We hired a jousting group from Niagara who came down, and it was a wonderful display. I wish we could afford to do it every year, but it costs about $25,000 to bring them in. 2006, our Chardonnay wins the double gold at the All Canadian Wine Show. In 2007, our Chardonnay was chosen as the official wine of the Ontario legislature for all official functions. So for that year, anytime there was a reception of any kind, our wine was chosen. 2008, our Cabernet Franc won gold, People's Choice Award, and the overall best wine at the Royal Winter Fair. 2010, our Chardonnay went to France and captured the Award of Merit at Chardonnay du Monde. 2013, we made our first export of ice wine to China. 2015, we received the Premier's Award for Agri-Food Innovation, excellence for its partnership with Canadian vinegar sellers in developing unique products for export and sale. 2018, we sold vinegar through Metro and Sobeys under their private label. And 2019, we made vinegar exports to Taiwan. Unfortunately, that's part of the close down now. So it's going to be a stressful summer until lockdown is eased and we can get visitors back to Prince Edward County. Normally, there are well over 500,000 visitors to the county a year, many of them going to Sandbanks Provincial Park. But we need the people to do the winery tastings. We love to put on displays of that barrel toasting, particularly at dusk, where it's very dramatic. And our pizzas are selling well. Are there any questions? I hope you've enjoyed it. Sorry, it's a bit long and detailed history, but hope you enjoyed it. Oh, there's my grandson coming on from Lausanne, Switzerland. Wow.
So I've muted you all, but you can unmute yourselves. If you have a question. I had a couple of questions. How long, first of all, the first one was, what's a cooper maker? And then you answered it right after that. But how long can you use the barrels? And yeah.
Well, for red wine, you would probably use it for 2 to 3 years. You might try and put 25% in a new barrel and 25% in a 1-year-old, etc.